6 o'clock, everybody. We probably should get started. For the record, History on Tap at the Cantilever, February 19, 2026. Well, welcome, everybody. My name is Mike Williams. I'm president of the Koochiching County Historical Society. That's your museum. To my left, I have Ashley Levine. She's our executive director. And to her left, we have Brianna Harmel, who's our museum assistant. But we also have Samantha Cooling, our collection manager, who is over here with by all the photos. But before we begin, I'd like to thank the Cattle and Cantilever for having us back again. This is the second time this year. And of course, I have to thank Jeff McHarg for his sound system. And then Darcy Sullivan of KCC-TV is filming from up above. But most of all, I want to thank all of you for attending. If you didn't show up, we wouldn't be here. So thanks so much. But our subject this evening is murder, mischief, and mayhem here in the borderland. It's a repeat performance that we did a few years ago, but with a few additions. Some of you asked us to do this, and this evening you're going to get it. But I will start. The crime, bank robbery, location, Rainy Lake City, in the year 1895. Rainy Lake City in 1895 was a boom town, and like other boom towns, it had hotels, bars, brothels, stores, jail, a school, and it even had a bank. But one summer evening in 1895, the owner of the bank, W.W. Butler, loudly announced that the bank had just been robbed. Two men, using the excuse of having a check cashed, had Butler open the safe, and then they promptly emptied it of its contents. They then disappeared. Bank customers immediately sent out search parties looking for the bad guys, but came up empty. Meanwhile, Butler disappeared. Suspicions arose immediately that Butler had actually robbed his own bank. He was overtaken in his canoe near Kettle Falls and was forcibly returned to Rainy Lake City. He used the excuse that he was on his way to Duluth or somewhere to replace the capital that was lost in the robbery. But somehow, all the money was found, replaced, and only two customers ever left the bank. And no charges were ever filed. The crime, murder, location, Rainy Lake City again. The year, 1901. February 1st, 1901 was an extremely cold evening. Bill Randolph of Kettle Falls had been delivering mail by dog sled and needed a warm place to spend the night. The Lakeshore House in Rainy Lake City would work well. The gold mining boom of Rainy Lake City, which I think everybody knows was located just across from Shea Shea, was a shell of its former self. The gold deposits had petered out and only a few people remained. But one of those persons that remained was Frank One-Arm Sullivan, and he was the manager of the Lakeshore House. Years earlier, Randolph and Sullivan had a falling out, and it was so bad that Sullivan often boasted that he would shoot Bill Randolph on sight if he ever saw him again. And it's unknown if Randolph knew of Sullivan's whereabouts. After Randolph secured his dogs, he entered the Lakeshore House with his pack and shotgun. As soon as Sullivan spotted him, he pulled out his revolver and began firing. Bill Randolph was hit in the right side and the left ear. He then pulled out his shotgun and killed Sullivan dead with a single shot to the chest. He left the establishment, hitched up his team, and went to the only hospital in this part of the country, Fort Francis, to seek medical attention. Upon his release, a few days later, he came back to the United States and was promptly arrested for murder and was jailed in Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids was the county seat at that time. There was a speedy trial, and Randolph was found guilty of murder. However, when it was discovered that the bailiff had supplied liquor to the jury, a new trial was ordered. This time he was acquitted. But Bill Randolph and his wife Kate continued to live at Kettle Falls until the 1920s, and then he became a successful commercial fisherman on Namakan Lake. And eventually he and Kate built and operated Borderland Lodge on Crane Lake for many, many years. The crime, murder, location, Koochiching County. The date, 1907. In 1907, the newly formed Koochiching County had its first murder investigation. Two settlers, James Gaudette and Carlos Williams, got into a dispute with Gaudette fatally shooting Williams with a .38 caliber revolver. He turned himself in and stated that Williams had threatened him and then shot at him with a shotgun. He said that Williams shot first, and to defend himself, Goddard returned fire with 4 pistol shots. There were no eyewitnesses to this confrontation, but neighbors that lived within earshot close by testified hearing 4 pistol shots, and then sometime later a much louder shotgun shot, just the opposite of what Gaudette said. The jury was convinced that Gaudette shot first, and then to cover his crime, retrieved Williams' shotgun and fired it in the air. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in Stillwater, but was released after serving 20 years. Koochiching's first murder. The crime, murder, location, right here, Rainier, Minnesota. The date, 1913. We're all familiar with Rainier's notorious past, and 1913 was probably the peak year for violence and crime. In fact, Rainier's population at that time was around 200, and there were 99 arrests in the first 6 months alone. Citizens were upset and blamed saloon keepers and local politicians for their encouragement of the lawless element that was drawn to the city. One man, Fred Kuchar, testified to a grand jury as to the open lawlessness in Rainier, and then promptly became the victim of probably Rainier's worst crime. He was called out into the street and beaten so severely by upset saloon keepers and their patrons, and right in front of his family, that he died a week later. No one was ever convicted of that crime. The crime, murder, again, also Rainier. The date, 1920s. A body was discovered floating one summer morning near the Rainier lower dock. The death was suspicious in that the body had a broken neck and a broken leg. The man was identified as Norbert Flett of Fort Frances. It was also learned that he would often carry a good supply of cash on his person. However, in those days it was common to walk across the railroad bridge, one that still exists, cantilever, from the fort to Rainier. Had he been hit by a train? We'll never know. But Flett was well thought of in Fort Frances, and the editor of the Fort Frances Times wrote, "Rainier is a good place to stay away from. Accident or murder? We'll never know." Ashley?
So I have 2 stories initially for you. And if you've been to this show before, you have likely heard them, especially if you were at the Prohibition show. And the first one is not so much a crime against any one individual, but actually against two communities, and that would be the city of Rainier and the city of International Falls. And this was called the removal of Frank Keyes and others. And so this happens between 1916 and 1918. But in August of 1916, Koochiching County miraculously votes dry, and we become one of the earliest counties to go dry before Prohibition initially starts and goes nationwide. And this set the stage for the city council, which later became known as the Saloon Gang Majority. And this is the city council in International Falls. And they began their defiance of the higher authorities, aka the state, to keep their town open for illicit liquor and other activities. And it was well known that people like the mayor of International Falls, Frank Keyes, had a particular business interest in keeping blind pigs or liquor establishments open. But he did close all of them except 4. And these 4 were relabeled as soft drink parlors. However, they were not serving soft drinks, they were serving hard drinks. And this was some bizarre effort to keep the peace amongst the community in town. However, obviously this is not going to satisfy those who had voted dry. And what did they do? Those people, because they were wet blankets, they complained. And they complained to the Minnesota Public Safety Commission. And that safety commission took action against the city, initially trying to force the body to require that these parlors would close at 10 p.m., which was the same time that saloons in wet counties were required to close, which I feel like that's a fairly fair request. They're not asking them to shut down entirely, just have to close at 10 o'clock. But what do the citizens of Koochiching County do best? We don't follow the rules, and we don't like to listen. And so when Rainier was presented with this idea of closing at 10 p.m., they said, no, thank you. We're going to do whatever we want to do, and they continued to operate at all hours of the evening. And same thing with International Falls. International Falls, if a bar was closing at 10 o'clock, it was because, for no reason, maybe basically because they were, dead. So in October of 1917, at the request of the Public Safety Commission, realizing that Koochiching County is not going to behave, and they requested that Governor Burnquist suspend Frank Keyes from office, as well as the sheriff, Thomas White, and the mayor of Rainier, who was Peter Gibbons. And so they had to replace those officials, right? Well, they went back to the citizens of Koochiching County and they were like, hey, can you find us some people that'll take this job? And Koochiching County was like, no, we don't trust any of the people that live here to have these jobs. So they had to bring in individuals from outside of the county that would have no financial interest or ties and, couldn't be bought to have those positions temporarily. That only lasted until March of 1918. And then those men were eventually reinstated to their respective offices with the condition that they were to uphold those laws. Now, did they uphold the laws? No, not really, because eventually, as Prohibition starts, of course, there are blind pigs that are operating. I would say the only people that were making a concerted effort to do that was law enforcement. You can see that in all of the papers where they're arresting folks and putting them in jail for running booze and whatnot. But the city councils and everyone else, they absolutely did not care, I think. So that is the first instance. And the second story that I have right now is, it takes place a few years later in 1922. And this is a story of 2 individuals that were murdered senselessly. All murder is senseless, I guess, maybe. I guess it depends on who you ask. So in September of 1922, on September 18th, Sheriff Van Etten, City Patrolman McMicken, and William Carpenter, who was also a patrolman, they set out to arrest 2 individuals by the name of Joe Beauchamp and John Nigro. And Joe and John were passing forged checks in 2 different department stores in International Falls. It was the Markowitz store and the Burton stores. And John Nigro had obtained these checks, he stole them, did not obtain them, stole them, from a foreigner that had been visiting the area, and he was forging around town. So at 10 p.m. that evening, Van Etten had received word that Nigro was hiding out in Joe Beauchamp's shack. And his shack was on the outskirts of town near the MD&W railroad yard. So the officers arrive at the shack, they knock on the door, they demand that these people leave the shack. They do not leave the shack because they are criminals. And the officers attempt to force entry then. However, Joe Beauchamp is armed and he shoots through the closed door twice. Unfortunately, one bullet hits Sheriff Van Etten in his left leg, and the second one penetrates McMicken's left leg, shattering his bone, and they later discover that it has severed a major artery. Now, Van Etten stumbles around the side of the building and encounters William Carpenter, who is also present. What he was doing at the time, I have no idea other than not being shot at. So he tells William that he needs to go and get help. And one thing to keep in mind is that they do not have any radio communication in 1922. In 1928, the one-way radio comes into existence, and the one-way radio only works for dispatch to communicate to the car. So they have to physically go run and get help from somewhere. So he leaves. McMicken is bleeding out. He has crawled into a ditch that is half filled with water. So now he's not only bleeding out, but he also has to not drown in like 6 inches of water in a puddle. And they get help. The men are transported to a hospital. McMicken goes to Craig Hospital. Van Etten goes to Northern Minnesota Hospital. Unfortunately, though, on September 19th at 10:20 p.m., just 24 hours after he had been shot, McMicken passes away from his injuries. He just lost too much blood. So then a posse is formed. Mayor Jack McDonald and another gentleman by the name of Frank King, they were part of this posse. They noticed that there was some activity at this little shack over in Jamison Addition. And that was apparently unusual, so they decided to go over there and check it out. So they walk up to the shack and they knock on the door. This guy answers and they start talking to him, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm waiting for my buddy. We're gonna go deer hunting, in a little bit," or something like that. And they figured that's legit, and they walk away. So then they get back to their vehicle and have second thoughts and realize that that guy seemed a little suspicious. And then it hits them that, oh, that guy was the guy we're looking for. This is Joe Beauchamp. So they go back to get him, and he is, of course, run away. So Deputy Reedy takes a posse into the swamps and the wooded areas with 400 or 500 armed individuals, which to me is insane. So you have to hope everybody likes each other, because we're just walking around in the woods with a bunch of guns. And they start pressing the woods for this man. So the noon whistle blows, they start walking around looking for him. At 12:30, Beauchamp is seen. They order him to stop. He does not stop. He starts running, smart. He makes it about 200 feet. He turns around and he figures, I'm gonna shoot my shot. And he starts shooting at 500 dudes with guns, and they fire back, and it's chaos. They don't even know if they've hit him when the smoke has cleared, and they start walking through the brush, and they find him dying in the bushes. So 50% of the problem has now been solved. He was found with a .40-65 and a .40-40 with lots of ammunition and a quart bottle of moonshine. And then the hunt for Nigro turns very vigorous. At 6 a.m. on September 20th, a man enters the Riddell Hotel in Ericksburg, and he is very disheveled and nervous and very suspicious looking. And there's a lumberman there by the name of E.E. Scott, who is sitting there just sipping on his coffee, and he looks over and he sees this sus dude that walks in, and he decides that he needs to go upstairs and get the owner of the Riddell Hotel and tell him that this guy, that we got to do something about this guy, is weird. So he gets Riddell, they come back downstairs, he is gone. They tail him over to another store called Ensman's store, where John Nigro, this idiot, is over there trying to buy shoes with the forged checks that he still has in his possession. And they take him with the evidence. They do like community, like what is it, citizen's arrest? And he surrenders willingly and he goes to jail. He confesses his crimes. He does state that he did not see Beauchamp after Beauchamp shot Van Etten and McMicken through the doorway, but he is convicted and goes to prison. Sadly, 9 days later, after Nigro is apprehended on September 29th at 8:30 in the morning, Sheriff Hughes Van Etten ended up suffering major hemorrhages, and he passed away, leaving behind his wife and one daughter, and he was 41 years old.
The crime, murder, location, guess what? Rainier. The date, 1920s. I call this one the water hole incident. Early Rainier had no public water utility, so it was common practice for the residents to draw water by hand from the lake. During the winter months, the most popular watering hole was just off the end of the lower dock over here. With so much use, the hole would be actually ice-free most of the time. As spring approached and the snow was melting, a body was discovered right next to the open hole. Apparently a man had been murdered and his body stuffed into the water hole. There was never any identification of the victim, and of course no charges were ever filed. But my dad always said that the people of Rainier drank water between this dead man's legs all winter long. The crime, smuggling liquor in the United States. The location, Rainier, right here at the upper dock. The date, 1921. On April 28th, 1921, the Falls Press and Border Budget ran the headline, "Booze Smuggler Shot and Killed." Koochiching County Sheriff Van Etten and his deputy Reedy had received a tip that whiskey was going to be smuggled from Fort Francis to the Rainier upper dock. They staked out the area, and sure enough, at about 2 o'clock in the morning, a car backed down to the ramp. Soon a canoe pulled up, and the three men began to unload cases of whiskey. All three were placed under arrest, but before being handcuffed, John McGuckern was able to break free and paddled off in the canoe in the darkness. Deputy Reedy fired 4 shots from his .32 caliber revolver, 2 into the dock and 2 just randomly into the darkness. The next day, a badly wounded McGuckern was found in his drifting canoe near the Fort Francis mill. He died the next day. Deputy Reedy was surprised and upset that he'd killed McGuckern. His shots were warning shots, and the chances of hitting McGuckern were extremely slim. But no charges were ever filed against the deputy. The crime, murder and robbery. The location, Rainier, Minnesota. The date, winter 1922. On a winter afternoon of 1922, 4 people, Jim Lessard, Albert Lessard, Pat Finnegan, and an unknown woman were having a cocktail in Lessard's soft drink parlor right here in Rainier. A man unknown to the 4 of them entered the building with a .45 caliber revolver. When asked by Finnegan what he was doing with the gun, he replied, "Perhaps you'd like some of it." He then shot Finnegan through the chest, fatally, and then Lessard twice in the upper body. He then emptied the cash register of $29 and left. Albert Lessard and the unknown woman were unhurt. Deputy Sheriff Reedy was called and was able to track the man down by following his tracks in the snow. When he found him, he was unarmed and easily taken into custody. He was charged with murder and armed robbery, and later identified as James Conroy. Jim Lessard survived his wounds thanks to Dr. Craig In a conversation years later with my father, Dr. Craig said that if Jim Lessard's heart had not been in the contraction stage, that one of the bullets would have killed him. We all know Butch Lessard, a longtime resident of Rainier, and Jim Lessard was his uncle.
All right, so I have 2 more stories for you, and they both take place around the same time period. The first one takes place in Craigville, and if you've heard some of the Craigville stories before, you know that it was not the greatest place on earth. It was not Disneyland. So in April of 1926, there were 2 gentlemen. They went by the names of McGinty and Cunningham. And these were 2 saloon keepers who greatly disliked each other. Some say that they might have had like some score to settle over some past disagreements. Other people said that they were chasing after the same, dancing girl that used to work in Jimmy's pool hall, wherever that was. But we don't really know what their issue was. Now, McGinty was known to be, and I quote, as bad a man as ever lived in Craigville. And if you had been in Craigville in the 1920s, there were a lot of bad people there. So to be the baddest one, you were 100% the villain in every story. But Cunningham was known to be the complete opposite. He was fairly kind. He was really great with children. But just like everyone in Craigville, he was carrying a gun. He always had one in his pocket. McGinty was also a strong guy. He was supposed to be a heavyweight contender at around 220 pounds, and his fighting name was Ben Franklin, if that strikes the fear into your hearts. And he one day decided that he no longer wanted to have this issue with Cunningham anymore, so he was just they were gonna duke it out. So he went up to Cunningham and he asked him, do you wanna shoot it out or do you wanna fight it out? And Cunningham was a big guy. And by big, I do not mean that he was big and physically fit, he was just big. And he told him that he was too fat to fight, so guns it was. Now McGinty carried a big .45, and he took out his gun and he shot Cunningham 4 times. But Cunningham did not die. Cunningham pulled out his gun and shot McGinty square in the chest and shot him right in the heart, and McGinty was dead immediately. So they took McGinty's body away. They drug him out to this ice house where they stored their ice for whatever, meat, drinks, put his body somewhere that they put him in the gross ice. And they left him there for 4 days, and they had to wait for the sheriff to come and collect his body. And the sheriff took 4 days because the sheriff absolutely loathed going to Craigville. It hated going there. It was a terrible place to be for them. And any time that they had to go to Craigville, it was because of instances like this. Now, Cunningham was laid up with an abdominal wound, and there was a young doctor that arrived and examined him. Now, this guy's got 445 holes in his body, and the doctor was like, no, man, you're gonna die. I can't save you. And his friends decided that they were going to seek help of another individual. And there was a clerk that worked at this place called the Norcross store, which was kind of like across from wherever they had Cunningham resting. And this clerk had been trained as a nurse. So that clerk, he came over and he tended to Cunningham and patched him up a little bit, and he had faith that Cunningham was going to make it. So Cunningham's friends raised the funds to put him on a railway gas car, and they sent him on a little trip to Grand Rapids, Minnesota, where he was treated, and Cunningham ended up surviving and making a full recovery, so much so that he was able to serve time for murdering McGinty. And I feel kind of bad for the guy, because I think that if he would have had a lawyer, he maybe would have gotten off on self-defense. Because, I mean, McGinty technically, like, kind of picked that fight. But, I mean, and Cunningham had 4 holes in him. But, whatever. So, and the last story is an unsolved murder. I have my suspicions of this case. But it happened in 1926, so I can't prove anything now. But anyway, this is the unsolved murder of Jack Ryan. And Jack Ryan had a little store near Kettle Falls, and his body had been discovered in the woods kind of either at the beginning of March or end of February. We don't really know exactly when the crime took place, just because this story wasn't reported until March 4th. So timeline, not super clear. However, Jack Ryan, super nice guy. He didn't seem to have any enemies. He didn't have any ex-lovers, scorned lovers, nothing like that. But he had been reported to have traveled to International Falls and Rainier to sell a number of very valuable furs. So when he left town and headed back to Kettle Falls, he had a substantial amount of money on his person. However, when his body was found, surprise, he had no money on him. But his body, he had a bullet hole in his head and also in his abdomen, but the back of his head was also crushed as if from a blow from a heavy object. And the way that the newspaper article reads, it sounds as though he received the head injury first, and then whoever murdered him shot him twice, which seems a little personal to me. That's speculation. So we don't know who killed him, and that case remains unsolved to this day, which is very sad for his family.
For the record, the sheriff still hates going to Craigmont.
They should. They should. It is not a good place. I'm sorry.
So this next story is a new one, or at least as new as an incident from 1937 can be, but it is new to the show. So, in the early morning hours of May 12th, 1937, between 2 and 3 a.m., for those of you who like the details, just outside the quaint little town of Lowman, Oscar Otteson awoke to a car parked outside his farmhouse, which was located along the highway. Oscar didn't think too much of this, as there's often cars on the highway, until his dog started barking. So he went to the door to investigate, and when he opened it, he was attacked suddenly by an intruder. Oscar was clubbed in the head by a blunt object, leaving a pretty decent-sized gash in his head. He was then forced back into his bedroom at gunpoint. His brother, Otto, was also home and awoke, hearing all the kerfuffle. He jumped out of bed and reached for a gun that hung on the wall. Seeing this, the assailant shot at Otto 3 times. He hit him twice, once through the arm, piercing his lung, the other into his back, and that one stayed lodged in his body. Otto would eventually, unfortunately, die from loss of blood about 12 hours later at the Little Fork Hospital. So, when Oscar was being questioned, he told the police that the entire incident took less than 10 minutes. Other than stating that him and his brother were attacked by 2 men, which he remained adamant about throughout the entire case, he was unable to identify the assailant that struck him due to a flashlight being shown in his face the whole time. Oscar also stated that he heard no one talking or yelling during that time, which is important later. So the motive for the crime was, as of yet, unclear. However, an empty gas can that was usually kept in the garage was found by the well the following morning. Now, back in the day, it was not uncommon for people to be stealing gas from one another. But there had also been a rumor floating around that the brothers had a considerable sum of money that they supposedly were showing off at the tavern about a week before. This was still speculated to be hidden in their home. However, nothing was actually stolen. The only evidence found in this case was the car stolen from Harvey Palmer that was left on the side of the road at Brown's Corner. There was also a Colt .45 that was found in the ditch a couple miles before the car. Fingerprints were taken from the car and the farmhouse. Authorities were also able to run ballistic reports from the Colt, and there was the first bullet was still lodged into the floor in the farmhouse. So the now Sheriff Reedy, who was investigating the case, opted to keep many of the facts of the case confidential due to it being one of the most unusual cases he's ever had. However, he had already had his eye on 2 suspects pretty much from the beginning. And on the morning of May 27th, Sheriff Reedy finally had enough evidence to bring Robert Christie, age 40, and his wife Agnes Christie, she was about 29, of International Falls in for questioning. Robert had previously served 2 terms in state prison for grand larceny. He stole car parts for a whopping $52. It was also mentioned that his wife, Agnes, had recently been released from a school for the feeble-minded. Another fact commonly known about Mrs. Christie is that she was frequently seen wearing men's trousers, shirts, and from time to time, a man's hat. So by June 7th, the Christies had just decided to confess. They said that Mr. Christie, they showed up to rob the brothers and got nervous and shot at him. He fired a warning shot when he saw Otto get out of bed, and then the next 2 were when he was reaching for a weapon. Although later, he continues to claim that he doesn't know why he shot them, other than that he was extremely drunk. He also stated that he could hear his wife crying and shouting, "Bob, come out." Upon further questioning, he claimed that he and 2 other men, Sam Hawkins and Charles Van Vleck, had been drinking the night before. The other men had revealed a plan to steal a car, drive to Lowman, and rob the Ottisons. He believed Sam and Van were using him as a goat, which I did look into it. Back then, it did not mean greatest of all time. So, upon questioning Mrs. Christie, she also stated that there were 2 other men involved, the same men. The 3 men had been drinking most of the evening when she met up with them. They left the tavern, and she believed, supposedly, that they were headed to a dance out in Lowman. However, while at the Ottison farmhouse, Agnes claims to have stayed in the car and that her husband had come running out of the house yelling, "I'm sorry, I had to shoot to protect myself." According to Agnes, the other men stayed in the house for about 10 to 15 minutes. Doing what? She didn't say. Even though she confessed to being there, they did not name her an accomplice. I couldn't actually find out why that was. Best guess, because she was viewed as a feeble-minded woman who couldn't possibly be clever enough to be involved in a robbery. I don't know. Now, the interesting thing is, neither Mr. nor Mrs. Christie could seem to keep their story straight. After being on the stand for several hours, Mrs. Christie in particular kept contradicting herself and her husband's story. They just weren't really lining up. Hawkins and Van Vleck had already been arrested 5 days prior to Mr. Christie saying that they were there. It was brought to the sheriff's attention by a citizen that the 3 men had been seen drinking together 2 nights before and then the night of the murder. However, both of those men were, they found they had legitimate alibis. They were at work the next day, and I guess you can't murder someone and go to work. However, they did dress up an officer and disguised him as an inmate, and he then interviewed Hawkins and Vleck. And this officer also believed them to be innocent, kind of believed their story. So they were found not guilty on July 21st, 1937. And only Mr. Christie was found guilty of murder in the 3rd degree. He served an intermediate term in state penal institutions, yes, plural. This sentence was meant to be carried out for no less than 7 years, but no more than 30. I was unable to find just how long he actually was sentenced for.
Thanks, Brianna. The crime, torture, and murder. The location, Flanders, Ontario, Canada. The date, 1944. The following account is most likely the most heinous crime ever committed in our area. It occurred in Flanders, Ontario, about 40 miles east of where we're sitting right now. Flanders was a small town adjacent to the railroad and was named after the famous World War I poem on Flanders Field. But in June of 1944, 4 young men, William Schmidt, age 28, George Schreineck, age 28, and his younger brother Anthony Schreineck, 23, and Eino Tillinen, age 23. Got on a train in Fort Francis and headed east to Flanders. The purpose of their trip was to go to the home of Mrs. Viola Jameson, who was rumored to have lots of cash in her possession. Upon arriving at her rural home, she was not home, so the men waited several hours for her to return. She did return with her 2 young sons sometime later. The boys were then locked in the root cellar, and the men began questioning Mrs. Jameson as to where the money was hid. When they had no success, they began burning her with flaming newspapers. That was unsuccessful, so they fired up her wood stove and sat her on it. No money was ever stolen because there never was any money. Meanwhile, after the men left, the boys eventually escaped from the root cellar and found George Armstrong, who came to Mrs. Jameson's aid, and then the alarm was sounded. But Viola Jameson died of her injuries on July 2nd, 1944. By then, the 4 men had been apprehended, and they were jailed in Fort Francis on a charge of murder. At that time, Canada had capital punishment, and if found guilty, the 4 of them could face the death penalty. The trial was held in Fort Francis, and with the evidence against them, the 4 were found guilty. Schmidt and the Schreibeck brothers were, as I said, found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Eino Tillinen received a lesser sentence because it was determined he was mentally incompetent. The date of the hanging was set for December 6th, and it would not be a public hanging, but would actually take place inside the Fort Francis jail. However, a stay of execution was granted until March 1st, 1945. On March 1st, 1945, the 3 men met their fate by hanging, and their bodies were buried in the jail grounds of the Fort Francis jail. Eino Tillinen served many years in prison and was released. Apparently he was a model prisoner and became a good citizen for the rest of his life. It should be noted that the triple hanging in Fort Francis was one of the last executions in Ontario. Capital punishment was totally eliminated from Canada a short time later.
All right, now for the mischief portion of the evening. We have International Falls resident wreaker of havoc, Art Strand. And as some of you may remember from previous shows, in 1968, 33-year-old Art Strand was notorious for his 2-month crime spree. His crime, you might ask, being a nuisance. Art liked to spend his free time breaking into homes to break things, take things, or just mess with your telephone, the speaker of which you could often find stuffed under your mattress. Shenanigans seemed to be this man's area of expertise. That was until he thought it would be fun, I guess, to start stealing guns. There may have also been an incident or 2 of arson, but again, mostly just silly shenanigans and harmless vandalism. However, he was now considered armed and dangerous. At this point, the authorities decided to step in, and after 3 weeks of trying to track Art down, his boat was finally spotted on Stop Island. That's when Don Johnson decided to pitch in by removing all of the boats that were docked on the island in an effort to keep Art from running. He managed to run away, sort of. Anyway, it was more of a crazy long game of hide and seek, lasting about 40 hours. What the authorities hadn't realized at the time was that old Art actually had given up on the game, got sleepy, and found a cabin to go to bed in. He was found in the morning and surrendered without a fuss. He was promptly taken to Don's house on Norway Island for questioning and to enjoy a nice pancake breakfast made by Don's wife. Don, who had known Art and who had known he'd been struggling with mental illness for some time, took pity on him, though, and suggested that they disguise him as an officer to sneak him off of the island to avoid the media. And yeah, that's the story of the infamous Art Strand.
Thanks, Brianna. The crime, murder, the location, several miles north of Ray, Minnesota. The date, November 26, 2010. This following incident is a different one for me in that I'm familiar with the families involved and have always considered them friends. But on November 26, 2010, law enforcement and first responders received a 911 call to the Carl and Linda Mugley residence just north of Ray, Minnesota. There they found Linda Mugley trapped under a 17-foot, 700-pound totem pole, barely clinging to life. She died shortly after. Carl, age 49, and Linda, 61, had been married 26 years and were well known for their construction of Native American totem poles. But from the beginning, investigators had doubts over Carl's account of how the accident came about. They reenacted Carl's account half a dozen times and could not get the totem pole to fall as he described. Furthermore, the investigation, as it continued, it found that Carl was having an extramarital affair with a woman from Alabama, and he and Linda had been arguing over a divorce. Also, there was a noticeable lack of remorse on Carl over his wife's passing. Carl was arrested 7 months later without incident in Stockdale, Texas. The charge was second-degree murder. The trial was held in Bemidji, Minnesota, and if found guilty, he could face up to 40 years in prison. But despite the almost overwhelming evidence that against Carl Mugley, there was a concern that the jury could not come to a unanimous verdict of guilt to second-degree murder. A plea deal was sought, and Carl agreed to plead guilty to unintentional second-degree murder. On February 4th, 2013, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He has since been released. We are now open for any questions you may have.
Okay, well, I don't know if you know it or not, but my mom was robbed at the Rainier laundromat right around 1961 by three individuals that walked across the bridge while it was down. And they were breaking in the laundromat, steal money, and my mom happened to go in there and do her laundry. And they told her to go into the bathroom, throw out her purse. And she did, and she hid in behind the chimney back there, and they robbed the place. One of the guys had a fake arm. Well, they robbed the place, they went to get out of there, and the bridge was up, and they couldn't get back to Canada. And my mom was still hiding in behind the chimney, and she heard a disturbance later, and she poked her head out the door, and it was Joe Fox was in there coming in to do his laundry, which was the mayor of Rainier at the time, and so my mom told him what happened. And so he called Jim Laurent that lived just a block away, and he was the deputy sheriff, and he came over there, and they started looking for these three guys, and they did actually capture them. the final thing, the nail in the coffin was that a couple weekends before that, my mom worked for the phone company and they were cutting pennies in half. And she had some half pennies stuck in her purse or in her wallet. And these guys had dumped her wallet out and put the money down this guy's fake arm. They couldn't find the money at first until they got the guys back at the police station. And when they dumped the money out and then they had my mom's wallet and they were able to put the 2 pennies together and incriminated the guys. They got 10 years in prison. And they were wanted in Canada, so they extradited them in Canada for 10 years at Stony Mountain. And then they were, if they ever came across the border again, they would have to do 10 years over here. But that was about 1963, I think, shenanigans in Rainier.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Any more questions or comments? Some of you must have stories. Oh, we have one over here.
This is a little later than the 60s. This is probably in the 90s, but this is my generation growing up barefoot in Rainier. Used to be a lot more places to hide out and have little places of forest and woods, but one of those places is up on Headlands Hill. And the kids that used to run around during my era had a habit of jumping on the trains that would come through and grab all the leftover securing lumber for their tree forts. And one day they did get caught and they had to write a apology letter to the railroad for stealing their tree fort lumber from the railway. And the railway didn't ask for any kind of compensation and forgave them, and they never got charged, but it was one of the things that happened in the probably 1996 or 1997. So juvenile delinquents, I think it was a Headland, one of my little brother who's since passed, Danny, and a high school boy. So there might have been a few others there, but fond memories.
Thank you.
Thanks. Oh,
I see a
back
hand
over
up.
there.
So what happened to the Robert Medicine story? He was next door to me and got knifed in the basement when my children were like about 5 or so. They were trying to accuse his wife, but they couldn't prove it. But that's always been called our murder house forever, next door to me in Stenberg Addition. I don't know, they were having a party and he got knifed in the basement. So I wonder what happened to his story.
What year was that? Do you know?
Well, Jason was born 77, and I would say probably 5 years maybe about after that. But, I mean...
So probably like
that was,
76?
Yeah, well, no, 75 plus 70, so 82 or somewhere in there.
Okay.
But anyway, yeah, because that's been called the murder house
Oh,
next
gosh.
door to me forever.
We'll have to look for that story. We had not found that one, so
Robert Medicine?
yeah.
See, I had a friend that actually served on the jury. And they ended up, this is, a few years ago now, but it ended up that they couldn't determine any guilt on his part because the investigation, the scene of the crime had been contaminated, and they came to the realization that Medicine did not commit the crime, that someone else that was in the building did, but they could not prove it. But that's the way I remember it.
It was a party, so that's why they kind of couldn't figure out who did it. I mean, they were pretty sure his wife did it. They couldn't prove it, but it still is one of murders in the neighborhood, so to speak.
Yes.
Anyone else? I think that's it.
Any more?
All right. Well, thank you guys. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you, everybody.